All right. All right. Hello everyone. Hello YouTube. Welcome to this is the second episode of The Vibe. With me, your host, Cody. Hi again. I don't know how long this is gonna take after uploading the first episode. If you like that and you're back for more, congratulations. Great to see you again. Today I decided I didn't want to do a big, highly produced video or nothing like that. We're gonna get into some media analysis, some media content. We're going to be talking about the Stranger Things documentary. Been a long time fan of the Stranger Things show. I started watching back during season 1. I remember not knowing who the Duffer Brothers were. I was in high school, which is crazy because I'm not in high school anymore. I went through college. And the show just ended. Obviously, if you're watching this relatively soon, the show just ended on New Year's of 2026. If you're watching this in the future, then yeah, it was nearly a decade of Stranger Things, and really, we only got 40 episodes. Think about that. Think about that as a show, right? We used to have. I don't know. We're watching The Flash right now. Me and my girlfriend, right? The old CW show, and that's got 7 seasons. It's got 23 episodes a season, and every single episode has some bad guy who's a gorilla or like freezes the city. Shows used to have, they used to run, every year. And have 22 episodes within them. Stranger Things ran for 10 years. We got 40 episodes over 10 years. Okay, so the show's a bit crazy in regards to that. It really, and a lot of people recognize this, redefined what a show could be in the, streaming era. That's part of the whole Netflix formula. Obviously, with Stranger Things, the first season, you could just binge the whole thing. Sit down on your couch, watch it front to back, not take a single break. No breaks. All Stranger Things, you watched all 8 episodes. It was fantastic. And that first season was really paced excellently. But like I said, we are going to be talking about the show a little bit because obviously it is tangentially connected to the documentary. But I do want to primarily focus on the documentary here. So one of the most interesting things I think in the documentary relative to the start of the show is the fact that producer Sean Levy and the Duffer Brothers were really pointing out what they aimed to do was to create an adult television program that starred children, which at the time wasn't really something that they described, wasn't really something that you ever saw. Most of the time, children's media was for and had starred children kind of thing. And I think what's kind of funny about how they talked about it, right? Sean Levy in particular was saying, like, no one ever made a show with kids for adults before. And I think that's really kind of funny because by the end of the show, it was pretty clear that the show starred adults and was for children. That's kind of my opinion. But with the kind of like, especially by season 5, like no one died. Some military people died, which is tragic, always. But you didn't really have people die, right? Which, like, if we're going to talk about season 5 for a second, I am of the belief Steve should have died in that, like, basically the first scene of the finale. where he fell off that tower. That's me. I think it would have done a lot for the stakes, and I think we would have appreciated more the people who did survive if anybody, experienced any kind of death from the actions, like going beyond that. But that's me. So, that's kind of the first thing that you notice about how the whole show is really. Like I said, it starts off starring kids for adults and ends off starring adults being for kids. Arguably, that's kind of what I got from it. So, and this just the whole like kind of arc of the show. I mean, it kind of every single aspect of the show seems to actually completely reverse by the time that the final season is shooting, right? We already talked about it, starring a kid for an adult, to starring adults for kids. That's one aspect. Another aspect they bring up a lot is like the characters, and I do think the initial season and couple seasons were really like kind of tightly character focused. And I think that as the show went on, despite what they say, there were a bunch of times the Duffer Brothers were like, it's all about the characters. It's like, no, season 5 is pure spectacle. And, I want to preface this a little bit. I respect that. There's a lot of craft that goes into doing this. And if you watch the documentary, you're really going to see there's a lot of like practical effects that go into us. There's like a lot of crafts work and artistry, and it's really incredible. I think season 5 is going to inevitably just continue to be dunked on for like sort of writing and story decisions, which is fair, but ultimately at the end of the day too, it's like that's one element of this show by this point. The production of season 5, astounding. Like, towards the end of the documentary, they end up bringing some numbers up, and one of the numbers is, I guess, 237 days of shooting, right, for season 5. That is crazy. And the other thing that is actually like a total positive about this is like that represents people making money and getting paid. That represents, sculptors and wardrobe artists and scenics, production assistants, like that brings so much for everybody like surrounding the show as a craftsman, right? Or craftsperson, if we're gonna be. And I'd like to be politically correct, but that's really neither here nor there. Yeah. So, but it is very much another one of those things that throughout, the kind of run of Stranger Things, I think it does start off a much smaller show with a lot less of like a sort of practical ambition. And I think by the end of the show, it becomes the writing has gone completely off the rails, but you really do have to respect the, kind of effects that these people were able to achieve, because it really is pretty incredible. And, again, say what you will about the writing, and there's not a lot that I can defend about a bunch of it. It really is. There's so much that goes into these shows, and I feel like there's so oftentimes this thing that happens where, like, the writer room doesn't perform well for the last season, and so it's like everyone tosses the baby out with the bathwater. I think the baby here is really the special effects and production. I think the dirty bathwater is mostly the writing. That's my take. You're allowed to disagree or agree. Maybe you thought it all looked like crap. There were a couple blue screen moments that were obviously like completely, and obviously there's some level of like, green screen CGI into this whole thing, but like it's still, for the most part, the documentary really showed that they did have a level of like, we want to make this practical, we want the effects to be tangible to the audience. That being said, it's never not funny in behind the scenes stuff where you see someone go like this. you know, because it's like, what are you doing? That's crazy. I always like to think about, like, what if someone walked up to me on, like, the street and, like, that'd be crazy. That'd be a crazy person. But not for TV, you know. In TV, that's people. Star Wars, Spider-Man. Spider-Man goes like this. That's what he does. I can do that. No, but genuinely, even if you weren't a great fan of the final season, you know, take some time, be appreciative of the fact that, like, a lot of people got, you know, a salary essentially for work. I mean, you know, I think that it's important to recognize how much goes into this beyond just, like, the story itself to a certain extent. I, you know, don't want to make it too easy on the duffers here, but yeah. So, but that's the other thing. I think, you know, in this kind of, like, spectacle, that sort of becomes like what it feels like the purpose of season 5 to a certain extent, and the documentary doesn't really help, you know, shore that up, right? It's when you watch the documentary, you know, the problems that they really face, the production more or less has to revolve entirely around, like, how to get this, like, all of this in, like, one take, or, like, how to make this effect practical, or, like, if they have time to finish the set, you know, all very important things. But you can't help but think, like, wishing there had been more time devoted to legitimately kind of, like, filling out a little bit more of, like, the logical jumps that the scripts make, right? Because we all have probably seen, you know, there are no demogorgons, no demobats, you know, there's just a bunch of logical stuff that doesn't add up in the writing, which, again, something that I really think that, like, within the criticism of the writing of Stranger Things, like, this show hasn't made sense for years now, right? This show has been off the wall. It's really, like, season 3, you know, for me personally, as, like, a Stranger Things fan, where it's like, yeah, this is completely beyond, you know, this isn't, like, the sort of, like, small budget horror thing anymore. Like, we for a long time have been living with a Stranger Things that is primarily based around spectacle, and I think season 3 was really only finding its footing within that, and I think season 5 is, like, a full heel turn to a certain extent, with putting spectacle over, like, a kind of legitimate, realistic character thing. That's my opinion. So take it for what you will, you know. So what else do we got here? This is my little page of notes. Oh, if you could try to ignore it, that would be best. Hope that didn't show up. I hope the back of that paper didn't show up. It might have. So let's do that again. We'll do it. You know, I might not even include this into the video. I've gotten kind of rambly. Yeah, but the documentary, I think the other interesting thing that the documentary showcases to some extent is, like, and I don't think it really, like, necessarily addresses this, but you know, you have to look at just how massive this has been culturally, right? And that's another thing where I think we do, as a community, need to, like, step off the brakes here, or step off the gas here. This show is way bigger than it ever should have been, right? The first season was really kind of like a fluke. It was just a miraculous work of television, really. It was, I mean, you know, pretty well written. A lot of people will agree. The tone was very consistent, and all this stuff kind of just, like, added up. And people, again, I think it really represents this sort of, like, coming into the streaming age. It's hard when you have something you can, like, look at all at once, and I hadn't really seen anything done this well like this before. So it becomes a really impressive cultural touch point. And I honestly think that was enough to kind of catapult it into a level of cultural significance that I don't know if any of the people at Netflix, I don't know if any of the people, the Duffer Brothers especially, I don't know if the cast, like, I don't think a lot of people were really ready for Stranger Things to become what it ultimately sort of ended up becoming, right? And there's a lot to talk about also with that. There are a lot of effects of Stranger Things popularity that are negative going forward. One of the things that I kind of touched on earlier, over 10 years, we got 40, 42, 41 episodes of Stranger Things, right? This show did not really, despite how massive it was, produce like any more than a normal. It actually produced a lot less than what we're used to for television, and the quality, like, that time did not add to necessarily like the quality of it. I do think it looks better than a lot of like just regular television. I talked about The Flash earlier. Certainly looks better than The Flash, right? And I think it's really impressive they were able to like step up to the spectacle of the show. But, it really limits the kind of journey you can have if one of the biggest shows like in the culture right now is something that comes out like every 2 or 3 years and only gives you 8 episodes, right? And there are a number of things that go along with the way that this is consumed that create problems kind of it down the line, I think, for television going forward. There's no level where I can ignore. It's like, COVID happened in the process of this. There's a bunch of, obviously we're still dealing with a lot of like political turmoil just in the world in general. And there's a lot of stuff that kind of happens that, I can kind of be sympathetic for why it took so long to get this all kind of finished. But we're talking again about 5 seasons of TV produced over 10 years that only really equate to around 40 some odd episodes of television, which relative to sort of what we're used to, with TV, isn't all that significant. And arguably, too, like, you don't necessarily get a better quality of, like, a character arc than you would in any other kind of show. I think there are some characters that really flourish. I think there are some characters who kind of fall by the wayside. At the end of the day, right, like, it's not like everyone was done so impeccably well that, like, 10 years makes sense for 40 episodes. And so we're getting, I think, for us as a community and what we're seeing, because that's, again, it took them 237 days to shoot all of this. And in the process, they were still trying to figure out what the actual, like, finale of the whole thing was, right? It's I kind of struggle to find the words, but it's underwhelming to a large, extent. I personally was not too, I wasn't like amazed by a bunch of the character work, especially by the end. That I think we talked about it a little bit earlier. I think this final season was really mostly about the spectacle, and I think it left a lot of the characters feeling like pretty underbaked, and it again represents a large, massive amount of time where, like, you still come away from it feeling like not a lot of catharsis for me personally. And I think part of that has to do with just the decisions that the Duffer Brothers made. A lot of this documentary was really them like talking about how they needed to be confident in themselves and have like their own vision of the show, and ultimately they really, like, you can tell through this documentary, like, they made this for them. This was their baby. They kept everyone alive. That's sort of where I kind of disagree with them in a way. It's great that they have the show that they liked. I think obviously like everyone on their set was incredibly connected to it from the looks of it. And I know there's like some rumors, especially surrounding like David Harbour and Millie Bobby Brown, which I haven't looked too much into. It seems like they were able to create a really great atmosphere for not only the actors to collaborate with them, but every other aspect of production as well. Which there's a tangible value to that. I think that that's great. But it's still, at the end of the day, very telling. All they thought about was, like, to a certain extent. And this is, it's interesting. They described that how they were trying to, like, break into directing, essentially. But really couldn't find their foot in the door until they started, like, writing. And that was sort of, like, the path they chose to proceed with, right? And the only thing that really made it took off, they described, was like writing for themselves at the end of the day. And this arguably like continues to represent, I think they continue to do that throughout the show. And by season 5 especially, I think every character in that show became like such their little darling, I think they loved everybody in that show. I think they didn't want to really like upset that sort of like all these like the balance that these characters had and that kind of chemistry and everything like that. And it's ultimately why I'm gonna guess that they kind of decided to steer away from having any significant like kind of character deaths by the end of the show. And I don't know. It really feels like a lot of the decisions sort of in hindsight aren't necessarily made for your catharsis or like you as an audience, but more so because like that's what they wanted. And I can respect that, but I also think it kind of shortchanges the people who really, got invested in this show. At least like that's how I feel personally. I can't speak. I know there are literally millions and billions of people who have watched this show. So, these are literally just my opinions. But it is very telling, I think, when there's so little episodes to a certain extent. And I from like what I've seen, and who knows, maybe it's just my bubble, a lot of people seemed to want more of that sort of like horror, more of like a palpable tension. I think it's very hard to, because this like, I think goes back to this whole like character writing, so much of the show claims to be about these characters. It's hard to get invested in any of these characters when it doesn't really feel like any of them are in any significant position of danger, right? I mean, even like Ted Wheeler, and I love the dad from that show. I love Ted Wheeler. But he gets like chopped up. I think both the parents should, like, they got devoured, and this is the thing, right? The Demogorgon can run through the military camp and kill all these unnamed soldiers. Who cares? Willy-nilly, and none of the characters come away dead, scathed, it's just... And also, going forward, even more so, I think that the end of the show especially kind of, I think, represented, and the disappointment here by and large comes from the fact that I think there's like some more spin-offs planned for this. I don't think there should be. Move on. That's my personal kind of opinion. Like, I don't need to see. Yeah, I'm sure I'll probably end up watching the animated show between seasons 2 and 3 or whatever, and I know that I've seen pictures of like more projects they have planned, but the idea that one of the most culturally significant sort of touchstone shows of the streaming era ends in a way that is like kind of leaving everything like a lot. I won't say they didn't tie down a lot of stuff, right? I think that like the upside down is like technically shut off, like all the characters have kind of gone their own ways, but everyone's alive. And I guess we'll see how much of this ends up really being like spin-off bait. Arguably, the more spin-offs there are, it's just kind of insulting, I think, to the audience of this show that it would seem to indicate that there was a kind of very clear intention to leave a lot of people alive so that you could continue to use the IP in the future. I hope, and again, like this is all very speculative, this specific conversation. I hope that really marks the end of it, but we'll see. We'll see going forward. I felt robbed at the end of the day, though, right, with the finale. I actually felt more of an emotionally cathartic experience watching this documentary than I did the end of the actual show, which is also a really weird position to be in as a fan of the show. I wonder what the Duffer Brothers' career looks like after this. I don't think this finale has brought them a lot of goodwill. And that being said, they nonetheless wrote one of the most culturally important television shows of this era. So I'm sure they'll continue to get projects, but it and I think this is also speaks to something that this show unintentionally did very well. When I watched it in high school, when I was watching those first seasons, especially the first season, I had no idea who the Duffer Brothers were. And next thing I knew, everyone did, right? And everyone was watching their show. That is what Americans want. that is what we all sort of want for ourselves. And I think especially now in a time where, like, what I'm doing right now, the hope is at some point I'll be able to upscale infinitely, right? And I think that the Duffer Brothers reputation for this show sort of mirrors this aspiration in us all to, well, at least, a bunch of us to kind of come from somewhere, have just like a dream. They wanted to direct movies and TV shows, and the unbridled success that they were met with was as much, arguably, of a reason to watch the show as anything to do with the story, right? So, and that's another thing that I find particularly interesting, because it represents also, this is another thing, that same kind of story that we kind of have seen unfold throughout the Stranger Things run, surrounding the Duffer Brothers, surrounding like a Finn Wolfhard or a Millie Bobby Brown, like everybody connected to this show who is like publicly visible to us now, they didn't have the reputations they did. There was a Winona Ryder. I didn't really know about David Harbour before this, but like Winona Ryder being one of the only major exceptions, even her career though wasn't like going crazy before Stranger Things started. So I really think that speaks to something that's very interesting, like sort of contextually about the show. And that's sort of something that the narrative of the show plays with a lot. It's something certainly that the documentary plays with a little bit. And that's sort of what sort of everyone's talking about, how great the sort of like personal chemistry between the actors is and all this other stuff. It really is kind of spectacular to watch a project that kind of came out of nowhere become one of like a fundamental, again, touchstone of the current era of kind of like popular culture, right? Alternatively, the thing that becomes really, really difficult about it is I don't think that this really represents a good change for our watching habits, for the creation of television going forward. Obviously, since the Duffer Brothers began shooting this, this kind of streaming platform and the streaming era and the streaming manner in which we consume television and the streaming kind of production apparatus have only gotten bigger, right? And this is a large reason, arguably, why we've seen a bunch of like sort of like writers' strikes and actor strikes. And, you know, I mean, there's some like mild AI stuff going on too, but the other thing is, again, think about it. Like over 10 years of time, one of the most culturally important television shows have released 40 episodes, right? What does that mean for like writers is a great question. At the end of the day, right, this nearly represents an almost entire year of work for a bunch of craftspeople. But we're progressively seeing shows runs get shorter. We're progressively seeing the like our own ability to produce this kind of stuff getting, I don't know if like limited is the right word, but like Netflix runs these kinds of shows, which, you know, a prestige sort of show like this, and I'm thinking about like Breaking Bad or like Mad Men, that used to be like those were all 13 to 12 episode seasons, right? And for Mad Men we got 6, for Breaking Bad for Mad Men we got 7, for Breaking Bad we got 6. Stranger Things had 5 seasons and 8 episodes, right? If you were to compare, and if honestly, even on like a dramatic level, this also represents a major undercut, right? This is not nearly as, you know, and again, like you can enjoy Stranger Things probably at a much less sort of like critical way than something like Breaking Bad or Mad Men or The Sopranos, right? You know, or even Game of Thrones. And I didn't really watch Game of Thrones, but I have seen Mad Men and Breaking Bad, so I'm gonna try to keep it to what I know. But Mad Men and Breaking Bad, for example, of like a very kind of show that was really talked about in the zeitgeist at the time, were not only actually character driven, right? Because then this is another thing. At no point in and Breaking Bad is obviously going to be more of a spectacle than something like a Mad Men, and they each have their own level of like engaging with sort of spectacle. But they were all character from beginning to end. Meanwhile, Stranger Things, and this is like a new, you know, our new era, really loses a bunch of the sort of, you know, character stuff. And it's not like clearly they're still trying to have these like big character moments. I think a lot of them, you know, this is moving beyond the documentary and talking about the actual season 5, fall pretty flat. But it's also crazy because it seems like with the documentary kind of paired with an analysis of season 5, you don't really, as a creator, have the time to focus on where the like pitfalls are of your characters when the show itself is so bombastic and huge, right? Like if you like I think for me personally, a low point was Jonathan and Nancy's breakup scene. I thought it was, first of all, another scene where they should have died. I think there are a lot of times where people should have died in this show, and particularly in season 5, and I think as a final season, it would have been cool to do. Where they talk about their relationship for 10 minutes as they should be dying, right? And then they don't die. And, you know, so there are a lot of people who probably really like that scene. It was so hard for me to get through, and I kind of went on my phone midway through it because I got bored. And it's so much like that, right? You know, The thing I think that happened is they realized they had an unlimited, I won't say unlimited amount of money, but they realized they had an unlimited amount of money, that they could do whatever they want, that they could take all the time they needed. And I think they really lost any pressure to have like limits. And I think that that's a lot of the reason why. And again, that's not all their fault, right? Like ultimately they're only supplied with what Netflix will give them. And even more, and again, Netflix's production kind of like rules now. A lot of part of the discussion of the final season of the show was this sort of like second screen thing where Netflix expects you. There's crime going on. We're gonna wait for the crime to go away before I keep talking. But that's crazy. Could they not wait? Could the crime not wait until I was done filming this? I guess not. Or at least the police. I'm kidding. Oh man, what was I even saying? Wow. This speaks to how important the point was. Give me a second, guys. Okay, yeah. The second screen stuff. A lot of people were kind of presupposing second screen. That's why the characters had to say, "Let's kill Vecna" over and over again, because if they didn't, you might have been on your phone when they'd all decided to kill Vecna. Even though that's not something you even really need to say once. I think we all get it. I think we all know what they're going to try. We've all been watching the show. None of us want Vecna to live. But, there are some rumors of, like, this kind of, like, second screen thing, which, like, as someone who's trying to create, like, television, if the production studio you're working for forces you to accept a kind of, like, secondary position behind whatever your audience is watching on, like, Instagram, that's not great, right? It'll probably hurt your writing and the pacing just a little bit, and especially for people who do actually want to engage with this as their first and only screen, it gets a little bit painful to have to listen to the same thing be described multiple times, right? And that's another thing I think that, like, should be considered when we talk about the writing. And it makes for also, like, the interesting thing about this documentary is that it's a send-off to the show, right? Despite any of the problems that it's created along the way. And it's not meant to be consumed with any amount of criticism or animosity towards Netflix or Stranger Things, right? You are meant to, kind of bask in the glow of a cultural product that has swept all of, our kind of collective consciousness by storm, whether you liked it or whether you didn't. And it's interesting in the sense that, throughout this documentary, you don't see them talking to any kind of executive about a second screen problem. You don't witness, for instance, any of the, rumored harassment between David Harbour and Millie Bobby Brown, for example. You don't really get to contend with any of this sort of, like, fan criticism, which is what makes, like, the statements of, like, oh, we just want to make this for ourselves by the Duffer Brothers kind of, like, interesting, right? Because as this show has progressed, the way that we consume media has changed drastically. And it's interesting because I don't think, like I said earlier, this way of production is really beneficial for people who watch television. I don't think that it's beneficial for the people who make television. And this is all, so here's, when I say it's not beneficial for people who watch television, where on a regular basis, getting less content that we did at a worse quality because of things like the second screen writing rule kind of thing. And that's in addition to, like, what do the kind of people at the top of our, under, like, production apparatus understand about what connects us to media. This season, this final season, really represents highly, and again, very impressive spectacle. It values that over character moments 9 times out of 10. No matter what they really say. This, and again, totally my personal read. But that's, I hear more crime. That's production value. I should get some of that. I should, I'll film a crime one day. That's morbid. We're just letting actually, I'm gonna cut while we're letting the crime pass. This mode of production makes it so that you get less television at worse quality, right? If we have Netflix actively placating your phone addiction and trying to keep seasons shorter, you're getting less. You're getting, and again, I want to stress, over 10 years, we got 40 episodes. 10 years, 40 episodes. This is very minimal compared to sprawling television shows of the past with a legitimate character growth throughout the whole season. And even, within this, the actual dramatic tension and quality of the show has only gotten worse since season 1, right? When the Duffer Brothers had something to prove. And this is where I'm going to get into, I've kind of talked about how this version of this Netflix streaming apparatus creates worse television for us. It creates worse conditions for creators to work in, right? We're talking more limited writers' rooms. We're talking about shorter times that creators have to fill out a character arc. And within the actual production of Stranger Things, the thing that also really works against the Duffer Brothers here is a completely rabid fan base, right? This show blew up in a way no one really saw coming, out of nowhere, and next thing you know, all of our expectations are on every single season of this show, right? And for every season, obviously you have people who like aspects, you have detractors, and this season really represents, the height of this entire, these 10 years of expectations. And a large reason why I think a bunch of these expectations were incredibly unmitigated is because of how little of this show we've gotten. Right? I mean, who knows? Maybe if we had gotten season a couple of seasons more within the same period of time, this or that would have happened, or maybe it wouldn't have been written as well. I have a hard time. Obviously what happened, but imagine if we'd gotten 7, 12 episode seasons of Stranger Things. They might have actually been able to withstand the amount of characters they put in the show. And, this is actually another major thing too. there is within this show not a lot of upsets, right? There's not a lot of like status quo changes. And there are a bunch of shows where it seems like the entire point of like the entire show is like status quo change to status quo change to status quo change, right? If you look at something like Breaking Bad, you know, he starts off a fucking high school chemistry teacher, and by the end of it is a drug lord, you know. Mad Men, while like a lot less severe of a character transition, like has a bunch of situations. You know, Don gets divorced, and I think with Stranger Things, like you get from beginning to end more or less the same thing, you know. And there are a couple times it's like Eleven loses her powers for a bit. That was like kind of like one of those major, but by the she's gonna get him back by the end of the day. I think with season 5, the biggest thing that happened really was Will developed kind of powers, you know, and that's great. That's just another thing they can kind of use to fight Vecna sort of thing. So it's not even like there's no cost to him, right? Like that might have been something interesting. It's like, you know, the only way to kill the ultimate bad guy of the show would also result in the death of like our friend. And it, again, like that's not considered in the writing. So, you know, I think that this show also represents a sort of like very stagnant story that gets told over and over and over again, which I don't necessarily have like too big of a problem with, but I think it sort of represents how Netflix is treating the audience, right? It's along a similar line of like placating, you know, your potential phone addiction, where it'll put it itself, you know, as a second screen product, right? And in a similar vein, I think that so much of television production has sort of gotten wrapped around this notion of like what sells and how to make money and what would, you know, allow people to continue to engage with this product, that it didn't really allow for Stranger Things to actually stretch its legs with what it can toy with for the fans. I think that's why there was a lot of complaint about people not dying. And I, you know, again, there are definitely some instances where you get more added to the show, but I don't think there are a whole lot of really times where you see a character make a decision that, you know, permanently keeps them or from doing something else, if that makes sense, right? Like a good example is, you know, Walter White decides to like sell meth, and you know that has lasting consequences. People die, people come in and out of his life. He has to like figure out how to maneuver this, that, the other thing. I didn't really pick up a lot of moments like that. And maybe I need to go back through the show. Maybe I'm kind of missing stuff. I think there are a limited amount, again, of these kinds of status quo changes. I think Vecna represents one of them. Like I said, for season 5, Will's powers. But I think at the end of the day, you know, a lot of these decisions on a kind of story level were safe. Were incredibly safe. And, you know, I've heard a lot from people around me who can't watch this sort of show because they said that the same thing happened over and over again. And yeah, I can't really disagree with them as someone who's been a fan of the show for its entire run, which is sad. I don't think that that's a great, and I think, you know, if that is like kind of how we're going to start seeing television shows are going to get a lot more boring if, you know, you can't have big status quo changes or shakeups or character deaths. Like, it's just not very engaging television. And this has arguably been like, you know, a major instance of this very safe writing being something that's catapulted IP into, you know, a lot of success. And that is, with that all being said, there are a lot of people who detract from the show and who criticize it because there isn't a lot of character death, and the stakes aren't really there. So we'll kind of see what happens with if that continues to sort of be a trend of TV that we continue to get down the line. But yeah, I think despite the popularity of the show, and again, some very, very good aspects, I think the original character work was really compelling. I think that a lot of the spectacle of the last couple of seasons has been really great. There are certainly things about the show that are phenomenal. There are some things about the show, I'd say the writing in particular towards the end of it, that just get very grating. But at the end of the day, this documentary is not meant to be critical of the show. A light fell. One sec, everybody. It was this light right here. I don't even know if it really makes a difference here. You know what I mean? Can you tell a difference? I can't. Maybe Editing Cody will be able to tell a difference. Yeah, right it. Did you? Interesting. But to kind of conclude my ramblings, and I say kind of conclude. I'm gonna conclude here. I've been talking for a while. I don't think that this new style of production will give us the same kind of premiere television that we became used to towards the 2000s, the mid 2000s, the beginning of the 2000s, the end of the 90s. And I think that's sad. Because, and this is again, this whole documentary is essentially Stranger Things propaganda, Netflix propaganda. If you love this show, I think you should watch this documentary. If you didn't love this show, this documentary will piss you off, more likely than not. Because it's all about the Duffer Brothers, realizing what they want to do and making a show for them, and yada yada yada, and that's all great and all. But at the end of the day, it's like Netflix just bought Warner Brothers, right? And a bunch of media mergers have been happening recently, and it's part of, again, I think that this is part of this trend, this money trend for and obviously a bunch of industries revolve around money. Television is no different. What sells, but it's projects like this that have enabled Netflix to become the kind of juggernaut that it did. And what did I get from it? A kind of middling finale for a show that's been running for 10 years that hasn't had nearly enough episodes, followed by a documentary where, and again, I don't want this to seem like I'm trying to take down the Duffer Brothers, because especially watching this documentary, I think really humanizes them. At the end of the day, too, with the criticism of media, they're people. They are just two guys who likely had no fucking conception of what this stage of production would look like. These are mortal men that people are turning into villains because they didn't know why Vectin needed 12 kids or whatever, or why there weren't any. They're just people, and they were working for 237 days straight on production alone. And that's without even seeing any of the freaking, talks with Netflix executives or any, there's so much work that goes into all this. And these guys, I cannot stress enough, are two dudes that are dealing with a literal army of people to make this show happen. So, and there is there is criticism you could levy towards the Duffer Brothers that is fair. And there's a lot of writing mistakes I think that they made in this last season, and that's fair, right? They're people. They are two guys. What I think is most concerning now that we're at the end of this show, and ostensibly, we are now in the streaming age. At the beginning of Stranger Things, we were coming into the streaming age. We are here, and I don't think I don't think it looks all that great, relative to what we were able to create before on a kind of larger scale like this. So, and ultimately too, the last thing I'll kind of touch on here, the show was much better when it had a lot less attention and a lot less money. So for anybody who was really drawn to this in part because of what I was saying before about the Duffer Brothers being unknowns catapulted into a level of fame that I don't think a lot of us can comprehend, that all began when they didn't have as much money, right? That all began with the tight writing. That all began with producing smart. That all began with, connecting with the right people and really taking advantage of, this new era of how we consume television. So, yeah, I think that's all I really have to say right now, probably forever, about the documentary of Stranger Things. If you want to hear my thoughts about the show more, the actual show, I have been toying with the idea of kind of reviewing it. I do really like the show. Let me know if you'd be interested in seeing that. And if you agree or disagree with any of the things that I said, I know it was kind of just like a long ramble. Comment down below. Let me know how you feel. And I'll catch you next time. Peace out.